That kind of out-of-the-box thinking is the thing that I've always admired in campaigns, kind of like the time back in the 2015 lieutenant governor's race. There was a Saints game on Thursday night. Billy Dungesser was the only person who was running ads on a Thursday night game. But if you think about it, it's an act of genius because in addition to all the people in the New Orleans metropolitan area who would be watching, you have Saints fans throughout the state as well, and they would be tuned into the game. And if you're the only person running ads, to me, that's a stroke of genius, as opposed to doing the cookie cutter idea of running ads during the 10 o'clock news or more likely the 6 o'clock news. So from my perspective, I can tell you, I saw a Neil Reiser ad. It was in August, I believe. There was one of those hurricanes back then on the Weather Channel. Angel Davis did not really start going heavy with her ads until very late. My understanding was she was doing buys elsewhere in the state because, of course, they're cheaper media markets. New Orleans is a very expensive media market to play in.
Sure.
And if you want to do it, you need to have a lot of money to drop into that region. And, this is also what's kind of fascinating, Steve, when you're talking about the dominance of New Orleans in this election. Typically, the New Orleans media market, which is everything from Bogalusa to Houma and everything in between, in other words, the 504 and 985 area codes, typically represents 34 to 35% of the statewide vote. This time it was 45. So in this instance, and of course the vast majority of that 45, or a significant portion rather, was the approximately 20% that came from Orleans Parish alone. So if you were a serious statewide candidate, that 35, or in this case 45% of the vote, is too big for you to ignore. And I think that that's something that the Schroder campaign realized, because one of the things I was seeing, not only in my specific polling, but in looking at the election night results, was that John Schroder had consistently done better in a lot of my target parishes with the early vote. I started seeing the numbers reverse as the precinct vote was coming in nearly every parish with a few major exceptions: Jefferson, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Tammany. Those are some pretty big parishes. And so the point being was the Schroder campaign, because of their dominance, had the freedom to be able to do what it took to win, which meant dominating the New Orleans media market, as you're mentioning to me, as well as the numerous ads I saw elsewhere. So I think that was, wise use of media is certainly something that played a part in this, especially if you have the additional challenge of limited resources where you can't afford to be on TV for 2 months, or let alone one.
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of the treasurer's race, what's your take? Does Edwards have any chance at all?
Very slim. Mm-hmm. Because what I see happening is you're talking about one Democratic candidate getting 30% of the vote.
Right.
And the vote that went to Davis and to Reiser is pretty much a Republican vote. And you have an additional factor, too, which I think it doesn't really affect the ultimate outcome, but it is something that has to be considered when talking about how the vote split will go in November, and that is you have a similar configuration that you did on October 14th, and that is you're going to have a New Orleans mayor's race on the ballot. So Orleans Parish will again have an outsized influence. And there really wasn't a lot of interest in the rest of the state to begin with. So if you were someone who actually showed up to vote in October, it's almost certain that you're going to vote in November. So I would expect similar turnouts is what I'm getting at, which would mean that the approximately 65 to 70% that chose a Republican candidate, they're largely going to line up behind Schroder, is what my expectation is.
Sure. Like on a really good day, Democrats would probably, in a statewide race, they'd be lucky to even come close. But
right.
If the Democratic Party isn't really going to assist the candidate, then what chance would that Democrat have?
And in fact, that's an interesting dynamic that you just mentioned that, thanks for bringing it up. Derrick Edwards got the vote he did without an iota of help from the Democratic Party, and he had so little resources to compete. He was not timely filing his ethics reports. And so you're talking about someone who had very little money to play with, yet he got 30% of the vote. Now, there's an analysis, or excuse me, an analogy rather, that you could use to predict Derrick Edwards' November showing, and that is if you were to look at the Kip Holden example in the 2015 lieutenant governor's race, where Kip was the only Democrat on the ballot and he got about 30% of the vote. There were a couple crucial differences between that race and this race. Number one, because Kip Holden was the mayor-president of East Baton Rouge Parish for 3 terms, East Baton Rouge Parish is the epicenter of the Baton Rouge media market, which covers 20% of the state. And so, of course, he got a lot of favorable coverage and did very well in the Baton Rouge media market in that runoff. In other words, he got votes that a Democrat would not normally get. I would also argue that in 2015, even with Kip Holden getting 45%, part of that was attributable to a strong Baton Rouge vote. Part of it, too, was I think that when you had John Bell Edwards winning by a landslide, to some extent there was a coattail effect that went on, which was even though Kip could not afford to be on TV, you had people who they went to the polls, they voted Democratic at the top of the ballot, and then they probably voted Democratic just as well in the lieutenant governor's race. So in other words, absent those 2 factors, I think Kip Holden would probably have gotten about 35% of the statewide vote. I think that's about what Derrick Edwards is going to get this time.